get started. We'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everybody to the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and to the 19th Annual ISTF Conference. We're so pleased that so many people are gathered here to discuss this important topic. It's of great interest to us. We'll be focusing on the intersection of food and forests in the tropics. And we have guests from as far away as Nepal and Australia, and we're very honored that they have traveled such great distances to be here. And importantly, I would like to thank everybody who's put a big effort into organizing this conference, as well as the people who have come to participate. And before we start, I would just like to make a few announcements with regard to the schedule and logistics. First of all, we're excited to announce that we're broadcasting live for the first time this year. And please let your colleagues know if they couldn't come that they can watch the conference online, and it will also be posted afterwards. And if you're a Twitter user, our hashtag is #ISTF2013. It's over there. And tonight, the keynote speech will be followed by a reception, which will take place on this floor at the opposite side of the building. Tomorrow, the conference will begin with breakfast at 8:30, and the first panel will commence at 9 a.m. For more specifics on the agenda, please refer to your programs. And if you have any other questions, you can find an ISTF member. I don't know what Ellen's telling me. Oh, I'm going to get there. And you'll find a green tag on the ISTF members' badges, and so you know to ask them questions. And there's also a photo contest going on in conjunction with the conference, so please cast a vote for your top 3 favorite photos. You'll find those hung outside as well. And as Ellen was telling me, we would like to make the impact of this event as small as possible, so please try to pay attention to what you can and cannot compost and recycle. For composting, we have special stands with green sacks, and that's where you can place compostable materials, so everything but meat and cheese, for the most part, can go in there. And even the plates, silverware, and cups are compostable, so please also put those in there. So that's all I'm going to say for now. I'm going to let Dean Crane introduce the conference and the keynote speaker. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you enjoy the conference.
So my name's Peter Crane, Dean of the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies here at Yale. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here for this 19th conference of the International Society of Tropical Foresters. And this conference is put on entirely by our students, Julia Fogarite and Karen Peterson and her team, with the support of the school, including the efforts of many staff, but also generous support from several sources, the New York Botanical Garden and FES Coleman Fund, the Tropical Resources Institute here in the school, SAC here in the school, the Yale Climate and Energy Institute, and the Council on Southeast Asian Studies. And Gary Dunning is also here from the Forest Dialogue, and he'll be running a workshop on facilitating multi-stakeholder dialogues over the course of the weekend. Before I go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker, I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of other guests who are either here or will be here over the course of the weekend. Dr. Rajesh Thadani from the Center for Environment Development and Research in India, and an alum of this school is here. Hope you have an opportunity to interact with him. Also, Professor S.P. Singh, one of the foremost authorities on Himalayan forests, and it would be great to take the opportunity while Professor Singh is here to interact with him. Written a very important book on Himalayan forests. And I hope at some point over the weekend that Amy Vedder, who's our Dorothy McCluskey Visiting Fellow this semester, and well known for her work on a wide variety of topics, but particularly the mountain gorillas in Rwanda, will also be here. I'd also like to welcome in advance Dr. Anna Herforth, who will be giving an introductory talk to the conference on tomorrow morning on the global movement on food security and nutrition agenda, joining forces with conservation through forestry. And Dr. Herforth is very experienced in that area, and it'll get this conference off to a great start tomorrow. So finally now to our special guest, Francis Seymour, who's currently Senior Advisor to the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and from 2006 to 2012 served as Director General of the Center for International Forestry Research, CIFOR, an international organization headquartered in Indonesia. Francis led the development of a new strategy for CIFOR, guided the launch of the CGIAR research program on forest trees and agroforestry, and contributed to many of CIFOR's programs and publications on forests and climate change. Prior to her time at CIFOR, Francis was the founding director of the Institutions and Governance Program at WRI, the World Resources Institute, and also served as Director of Development Assistance Policy at WWF in DC. She spent 5 years in Indonesia with the Ford Foundation too, focusing on community forestry and human rights. And Francis, it's a great pleasure to have you here this evening. Thank you for coming. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Francis Seymour, to kick off this year's ISTF conference.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks, Dean Crane, for that overly kind introduction, and thanks to the members of the student committee that organized this conference that done such a great job on. As some of you may have heard, I had a bit of an arduous journey to get here today from Washington, and as a result, this address is not quite as polished as it might have been if my plane hadn't been delayed and a few other things. But in fact, I think it's time to confess that my arrival here in New Haven is in fact 30 years late. When I was applying to graduate schools, one of my top choices was the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Now, I was lucky to be admitted here, as well as to the Public Policy School at Princeton. And not wanting to have to choose between these two wonderful options, I proposed a joint degree. Princeton was up for it, but Yale wasn't. So I went to Princeton. And as a result, I've been an imposter in forestry world ever since. And so I have to wear this color wherever I go to sort of try to pass as somebody with forestry credentials. Anyway, I really appreciate your giving me a second chance to join the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, if only for a day. By way of explaining why I'm not using PowerPoint, I should also mention that my father attended the divinity school just up the hill back in the 1940s for several years. He went on to preach a sermon every Sunday morning for 40 years and never used PowerPoint, so I figure I can do without it as well. Now to the business at hand. The theme of this conference being launched this afternoon is Forests and Food Security, Cultivating Resilient Landscapes. And I congratulate the committee for choosing such a timely and important topic. And I'm especially pleased to have been asked to give this opening talk, because at this stage in the proceedings, it seems much more appropriate to raise questions and pose dilemmas, and then leave it to you guys to answer those questions and resolve those dilemmas over the course of the conference. So my job is the easy one. So over the next 40 minutes or so, let me pose 3 questions and 3 quandaries that I suspect will be recurrent themes in your discussions over the next few days. And my perspective is not one from academia, but from someone who spent the last 6 years working at the intersection between international forestry world and international agricultural world from a base in Indonesia. And my objective is to help you think through the relevance of this conference to the policies and indeed the politics that characterize the activities of those two worlds. So the first question to tackle is, why is forests and food security an important topic? My answer to that question is that it's important because most people still think that there's a zero-sum trade-off between protecting forests on the one hand and achieving food security on the other. Or they believe that all we have to do to avoid those trade-offs is simply to intensify agricultural production. Now, those of us who inhabit forestry world sometimes forget that the things that we take for granted aren't very well known even among policymakers, much less among the general public. And if you don't know any better, it makes perfect sense when somebody says, well, you know, it's too bad about those forests and those cute wildlife that you environmentalists care so much about. But hey, you know, we've got all these poor people to feed, and we're just going to have to sacrifice the forest to extend cultivation to feed a hungry world. So, you know, in that understanding, there's no recognition of the many ways that forests contribute to food security, both directly and indirectly, which means that the land use trade-off between forests and agriculture and forests and food is not, in fact, zero-sum. And in fact, it's estimated that over the last 40 years, well more than 2/3 of the increase in agricultural production in the developing world has come from intensification rather than opening up previously uncultivated lands. So extensification doesn't seem like that promising a strategy to feed the world anyway. But this trade-off framing is favored by those whose interests are served by perpetuating the outdated and increasingly inaccurate myth that it is poor people who are the main driver of deforestation. Saying that poor people are a cause of deforestation has in fact been attributed to me by a NGO that purports to serve the interests of poor people, but in fact is associated with corporate interests. And a fabricated quote from me was posted on their listserv as part of a campaign to restrain efforts, the commercial forest clearing that is in fact responsible for the preponderance of forest clearing today. So in order to refute that kind of information, it's really important for us to understand and to be able to articulate the degree to which the causality is actually the other way around. In other words, not that food insecurity is the main cause of deforestation, but rather that deforestation can be an important contributor to food insecurity. Now, a second myth that needs attention is one that accepts the importance of forest protection, but assumes that all we have to do is intensify agricultural production in order to spare land for forests. But you know, research conducted by David Kamowitz and Errol Engelson and others at CIFOR back in the 90s showed that depending on relative prices and access to markets, increases in yields can actually accelerate deforestation because it increases the profitability of bringing new lands under cultivation. So support for agricultural intensification is of course going to be necessary to feed the world, but it is certainly not sufficient and has to be accompanied by changes in markets and governance to restrain forest conversion and protect forests, or we could end up with those unnecessary trade-offs after all. Now, the second question that I think all of you are going to need to get clarity on in your discussions are, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about forests and food security? Now, I note that the presentation entitled The Edible Forest, I love that title, is scheduled to go last. But I would think that it's actually an important point of departure for a discussion about forests and food security. That is, the foods that are directly sourced from forests or trees. So, you know, for example, it's estimated that bushmeat provides as much as 80% of the protein in diets in some parts of the Congo Basin. And a colleague of mine at CIFOR, known to many of us, did a back-of-the-envelope estimate that the bushmeat that's produced by the Congo Basin forests is roughly on the same order of magnitude annually as the beef that's produced in the Amazon basin, and all that without cutting down any trees. Now, we can also talk about how wild fruits and nuts provide important micronutrients, otherwise missing in grain-based diets. We can talk about how forests provide the wood fuels necessary to cook foods. And we got to note that the availability of food from the forest can be especially important in times of crop failure or famine, or to particularly vulnerable groups, such as AIDS orphans. So it's clear that such foods can make a significant contribution to particular aspects of nutrition, of particular groups of people in particular places and at particular times. But I would argue that too much emphasis on forest foods as the key link between forests and food security is to downplay the broader direct and indirect contributions of forests to rural livelihoods, as well as to food security more broadly. And it's great that this conference is not falling into that trap. So what else do we need to talk about when we talk about forests and food security? Perhaps most obviously, but not always stated for some reason, is that forests are the setting for swidden agricultural systems. And so I'm really glad to see the paper by Diane Russell et al. Being presented in the program on Saturday. Because I recently read an article that stated, and I'm quoting here, oil palm plantations store more carbon than any alternative agricultural land use. And all I can figure is that the authors forgot that swidden agriculture is an agricultural land use that maintains a great deal of carbon in the landscape. We also need to talk about forests as a source of cash income. As Amartya Sen argued about 3 decades ago, food security is not just about the availability of food, but it's about access to income with which to buy food. So in addition to talking about foods sourced from forests and trees, we need to talk about income sourced from forests and trees in a broader livelihoods framework. Now, research conducted by CIFOR and a number of other partners in the context of the Poverty and Environment Network, or the PEN project, provides some useful analysis. PhD students participating in the project collected income data for more than 8,000 households in villages in and around forests in 25 countries to determine the proportion of income that they got from forests over the course of a year. And they found that, on average, about 23% of household income in such communities was from forest products, and that was more than the average share from agricultural crops. And it's also important to remember that that share of the income, that is the share from forests, is likely to be particularly important to women, because women tend to take the lead in the gathering, processing, and trading of non-timber forest products. So we've established that forests have an important link to the food security of individuals, to households and communities that manage them for wild food, for swidden agriculture, and for income with which to buy food. But do we stop there? Certainly not. Because it's becoming increasingly clear that the fate of tropical forests has implications for food security up to and including at the global level through the mechanism of providing the forest-based ecosystem services that support agricultural production. At the farm level, forests and trees provide shade and fodder for livestock, help control erosion and maintain soil fertility. At the landscape scale, we know that forests provide hydrological services, regulating water for irrigation, provide pollen services that support yields, and habitat for freshwater and coastal fisheries. And there's increasing evidence that forests influence the climate at the continental scale. So I was really happy to see the presentation about Brazil, lungs to breadbasket, on the program tomorrow, because I think this is a scale of analysis that needs a lot more of attention. Just for example, there's a forthcoming paper in Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics that advances a new theory that condensation and evaporation drive the atmospheric pressure gradients that in turn drive wind and rainfall patterns, which would make the role of forests even more important in climate regulation. And of course, at the global scale, there's recently been lots of attention to the role of forests in mitigating climate change through the function of carbon storage, and I feel like many of us have been consumed by the REDD agenda for the last several years. But forests are also critical to global food security for the role they play in storing the germplasm in the form of wild relatives of economically important crops that come from forests. And finally, all of these forest-based ecosystems become more important in the context of adaptation to climate change, where we need the resilience of intact ecosystems and the biodiversity that forests maintain. And as the title of panel 1 tomorrow suggests, we need to think beyond yields, how forests and trees contribute to resilience. But in a meeting with students this afternoon, Jeff, shout out to Jeff, reminded me that we also need to talk about how we can contribute to the resilience of forests and trees to climate change so that they continue to providing those adaptation services. Okay, now to the third question. And these are with increasing difficulty. Okay, whose food security are we talking about? To have a meaningful conversation about forests and food security, we need to be clear about the scale of our analysis, both in terms of the geography of production and the geography of consumption, or else we could easily end up talking past each other. Okay, I've given you a brief inventory of all the forest-based ecosystem services important to agriculture. And with those in mind, one could easily imagine an example of a local scale land use change converting forests to crops or mangroves to fish ponds that could increase the food security of the local farmers while contributing to negative externalities at the landscape, continental, or global scales. And conversely, I think we could each imagine a larger scale land use change, converting forests to agriculture, that could displace and impair the livelihoods of the local community in a country, of their food security, while leading to an overall increase in the food security of a country or a region or recent migrants or even consumers on another continent. And it is this last possibility, I believe, that is at the heart of the controversies over the so-called land grabs that proliferated in the aftermath of the most recent food price spike, and the associated export bans on grains. Because a number of countries that were dependent on food imports made it their business to start prospecting for pieces of real estate around the tropics that they could cultivate to secure their direct access to food. And what they found was that forest areas were among the softest targets for cutting deals with national and local officials for large tracts of available land. Now, while I hesitate to say anything about Borneo within 50 miles of Michael Dove, I can't help but bring up the particularly complex examples of, whose food security that are unfolding in Kalimantan these days, with the incredibly rapid conversion of forests and peatlands to oil palm cultivation. Now, it's true that much of that development has been fraught with conflict, and some of it has been overtly resisted by local communities. But a forthcoming paper by Joanna Clerk and Esther Mwangi documents how some Dayak communities in West Kalimantan are choosing voluntarily to work with companies to convert forests to oil palm. And even though they might not be getting a very good deal in terms of compensation or benefit sharing, the expected $1,000 per month per household is an offer too good to refuse in light of really little current income from the forest. And arguably, the palm oil that they produce keeps prices lower than they would otherwise be for the consumers in Indonesia, India, and China who use palm oil as a staple cooking oil. So, whose food security? But a third possibility, rather than the win-lose, lose-win, is a lose-lose outcome from land use change undertaken in the name of food security. Now, the best example I know of, again, comes from Kalimantan, and that is the million-hectare rice project in central Kalimantan. As you may know, rice self-sufficiency has always been central to Indonesian national politics. And back in the 1990s, President Suharto decided to shore up rice production capacity by ordering the clearing and draining of 1 million hectares of peat swamp forest. And unfortunately, nobody with the necessary knowledge of agronomy had the necessary courage to tell him it wouldn't work. So now, local communities are left with a heavily disturbed landscape, while the rest of us are stuck with a gift that keeps on giving. The organic matter in the peatlands, which can be up to 30 meters deep, as it burns and decomposes, emits a globally significant source of greenhouse gas emissions, which thereby threatens everyone's food security. Clearly, what we're looking for is win-wins, ways to increase agricultural production that enhance local food security without compromising or perhaps even enhancing food security at other scales. These options include agroforestry, and they include shifting agricultural expansion to already deforested lands, which is an obvious answer to many of the problems related to oil palm expansion in Indonesia right now. And I'm delighted that Jonah Bush is going to be telling you guys more about that tomorrow. Now let me shift to the quandaries. Quandary number one. How should we frame the forests and food security issue when communicating with various audiences? The way an issue is framed often determines who's interested in the issue and the kinds of politics and policies that are brought to bear on solving it, and those in turn drive who benefits and who loses. So it's critical to get the framing right And I'm sure the discussions to take place at this conference will make an important contribution to our understanding of the implications of various options. As I hope I've made clear, there are a number of serious misconceptions out there that need to be refuted relating to the supposed trade-off relationship between forests and food security, the importance of complementing intensification with market and governance reforms, and the many ways that forests contribute to food security beyond just forest foods. But I have to tell you, in my view, I don't think Forestry World has done a very good job in communicating across these various issues. So, to provide just one example, I was both surprised and disappointed a couple of years ago when a group of forestry agencies got together to do a joint press release on the occasion of World Food Day. And the first draft of that press release focused almost exclusively on forest foods. You know, we could wish that it were otherwise, but talking about caterpillars and mushrooms is just not the way to get forests a seat at the table when policymakers are talking about global food security. But it is a quandary because our moral instincts would lead us to focus on the food security linkages that are most important to the poorest and most vulnerable community, you know, people who are directly dependent on forests. But there's also another reason, I'd say, and that is the unevenness of the research basis that's necessary to underpin making the broader case. There's a lot out there on the linkages between forest biodiversity and food security and indeed health at the local level, on linkages between, and on the one hand, and on linkages between forest, climate change, and food security at the global level. Just to cite two examples, CIFOR contributed to a useful special issue of International Forestry Review a couple of years ago that highlighted the linkages among forest, biodiversity, and food security, but the main center of gravity was at the community and household level. And also recently, Ruth DeFries edited a special issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences about reconciling the imperatives of tropical food production on the one hand and global climate change mitigation on the other. But I sense that there's a missing middle of empirical research on the ecosystem services provided by forests to agricultural production at landscape and national scales, not to mention the continental scales, and the growing importance of those services to adaptation to climate change. I feel like we all cite the same study about how coffee yields decrease with distance from the forest edge in Central America due to the services of forest-based pollinators. And for some of us, coffee is a staple food, let's just be clear. So we need more studies like that because it's precisely those linkages that would be of most interest to the national and subnational policymakers who are the ones making the decisions about land use allocations. They're the ones who need to understand why forests are important to agricultural production. So in addition to thinking hard about the way to talk about forests and food security, there's still a lot of research to be done to back up the assertions that I've been making with a lot of hand-waving with a more rigorous evidence base. Quandary number 2, again, with increasing difficulty. Should we dismantle the barriers between forestry world and agriculture world and talk only about landscapes? Now, this is a real dilemma. The case for integrating forestry and agriculture across landscapes is abundantly clear for both conceptual and practical reasons. We know that individual households put together livelihood strategies that combine income from forests, agroforestry, agricultural crops, livestock, many other sources. So for them, the boundary doesn't make any sense. We know that agroecosystems don't have clear boundaries between forests and cultivated areas, and that landscape mosaics might in fact be the best way to achieve certain conservation objectives, such as agricultural biodiversity. And we know that the strict division between systems for administering forest land and agricultural land separately is an artifact of particular cultural and political preferences. If you haven't seen it, I recommend a very useful article by Nancy Peluso and Peter van der Geest. And it illuminates how the creation of what they call political forests in Southeast Asia was in fact an instrument used by states to distinguish between jungles as places where insurgents took cover and agricultural landscapes where the state maintained control. And it would certainly make life easier for the World Agroforestry Center if these artificial agriculture and forestry divisions would go away and the discourses and policies and institutions were based on landscapes. Poor ICRAF has been uncomfortably straddling that fence between agriculture world and forestry world since it was founded and has been working to dismantle that fence ever since. And indeed, there are some signs of a shift towards a landscape approach, starting with the framing of this conference. I note that the second panel of the conference is reconciling interests at a landscape scale. So a way to do that is merging agriculture and forestry. And I can tell you that a landscape approach is currently very popular with our colleagues over at the World Bank. And the most recent development that some of you may be aware of was the decision to discontinue the tradition of having a separate Forest Day at UNFCCC COPs in favor of combining forces with Agriculture and Rural Development Day with a vision of having a joint Landscape Day or Landscape Weekend instead. But taxonomy matters in bureaucracies. So while embracing the clear benefits of a landscape approach, we need to have our eyes wide open to the risk that important things could be lost if forests as a separate category goes away. Those of you who have ever been involved in an organizational merger know that what usually happens is that the unique identity and values of the weaker partner are completely eclipsed by those of the stronger partner within about 3 years. So there's some risk that the forestry part of the figurative landscape would be politically and institutionally overwhelmed by the agricultural part before too long. And I can tell you that having led the one forestry center in the 15-center CGIAR Consortium of International Agricultural Research Institutes, it was always a struggle to get what we considered to be a fair share of funding and attention to our agenda. Now, last year I was at a meeting of forestry sector donors, and they got into a discussion about the importance of having a separate funding category specifically designated for forests. And one representative of a bilateral donor agency that will be unnamed told a story about a long internal agency discussion about whether to reserve either 3% or 5% of a big multi-million-dollar agriculture and natural resources investment fund for forests. And in the end, they decided that 0 would be the easiest. And indeed, when USAID organized to create a new unit focused on food security, one of the consequences was that CIFOR no longer received funding from the CGIAR allocation. Now, fortunately, Diane Russell and her team were able to find a way to get us funding from another pot of money at USAID, so not all was lost. But here's a case where a focus on food security meant no focus on forests. So the quandary is, how do we mainstream the forest agenda into a broader landscape approach to food security without having it disappear altogether? Quandary number 3. Again, this is the hardest. How do we design market and governance mechanisms to protect forests that at the same time respect local rights and give weight to the legitimate food security concerns at different scales? Now, this quandary is foreshadowed in the theme of the third quandary of this conference, large-scale governance and small-scale farming. And it's a set of issues that Ben Kashore's little finger knows more about than I will ever understand. But as I've learned more about international efforts to incentivize sustainable palm oil production, I'm increasingly aware of just how hard it is to design global governance and market mechanisms that are sufficiently targeted so as to avoid the type 1 and type 2 errors of rewarding the bad guys on the one hand or punishing the good guys on the other. So, as an example, many NGOs have invested in working with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And I'm sure Gary Dunning is going to have some useful insights on such multi-stakeholder processes in the workshop he's leading tomorrow. But it appears to me that in this one, the interests of many of the participating companies and a sort of least common denominator dynamic have resulted in a certification system that doesn't yet prevent certified companies from continuing to deforest, on the one hand, and without making it especially easy for smallholders to benefit on the other. Jonah Bush and I were at a forum a few weeks back, convened by an important consumer of palm oil that wanted to make a commitment to sourcing only certifiably, sustainably produced palm oil that did not constrain the legitimate aspirations of smallholders to improve their livelihoods. And unfortunately, it seemed that we've got a ways to go before that's really possible, to make such a commitment. So there's a lot of work to do. Now, I said that I only had 3 quandaries, but since we still have extra time, right? I'm going to throw in one more quandary as a bonus for extra credit. Quandary number 4. Given the multiple challenges of mobilizing forests for food security and the urgency of doing so, where do we focus our efforts? This question is important whether you're a Yale student choosing a career path, whether you're a faculty member choosing where to focus your research agenda, or a donor in the position of allocating scarce funds to forests and food security. And the good news, I guess, is that there are plenty of challenges to choose from across all disciplines and scales. There are technical challenges, there are economic issues, there are governance challenges, and indeed there are political challenges, not to mention the communications challenges that I mentioned earlier. But it's certainly good news that there's plenty of talent in this room that can be applied to overcoming those challenges. But time is short and money is tight, so you've got to choose wisely. So I hope that the discussions of this conference will help us have a sense of priority among those challenges as well as a sense of opportunity. Now, I usually end these speeches by saying, I look forward to your questions. But having provided the questions and quandaries to you, this time I get to say, I look forward to your answers. Thank you very much.
On that note, if anybody has answers they'd like to give her, or we'll take questions too, I think. We have a few minutes for that, so just raise your hand and I can bring you the mic. No one has answers.
Okay, we'll do questions.
Hi, my name is Judy. I graduated 2010 FES and also School of Management. And with the work that I do with the indigenous people in the Amazon that are cacao growers, now make their own chocolate, market it not only to affluent and middle-class clients in Ecuador, they export to various continents. What we've researched and found is that people in forest areas have an abundance of natural resources, but they have no markets in their near proximity that they can market those products to for a high price. So they must package, process, and somehow get it to urban locations that will pay for these scarce resources. Now, how can we balance that out is the big question, but I do think that is one of the answers to this concern with food security, that you may not have to sell only to rich clients, but at least a location where the product is somewhat more scarce so that you can provide for the labor required to cultivate and maintain these forest products in sustainable production. Thank you.
No, I really appreciate that. I agree with you that that's one of the answers. And back to this palm oil example, I mean, one of the problems is that even with this fairly low standard of certification, certified palm oil available, only something like 50% of the available certified palm oil is being taken up by the market. So there's a huge job to be done to increase the demand for environmentally preferable products, just to take up the demand, much less to provide a price premium or any kind of preferential market access. So yes, access to market is huge.
Any other questions over there? Probably not the most efficient way to do this.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Regarding your first quandary, the need for really rigorous research on mechanisms of ecosystem services, you've listed our favorite paper, and you also listed the most commonly sort of accepted ecosystem services. If we had to focus our efforts in a smart way, which services would you recommend that we study mechanistically first? Is it hydrological? Is it something more to do with soil services? Is it with production of given products? Do you have sort of a personal sense on that?
You know, this is something that should be done more systematically rather than me talking off the top of my head, but since you've asked me, I would say water services needs more research, in part because they have been controversial in the past. I mean, I don't know how many of you were aware of the big controversy coming out of CIFOR about, you know, forests and floods, you know, do forests control floods or not? And I think there's more work to be done. And astonishingly, you know, after all these years, there still hasn't been a lot of empirical research to actually, you know, answer the questions that were raised in that controversy. And given that pretty much everybody agrees that the next big crisis is going to be a global water scarcity crisis, everybody's going to be interested in water. And so I think getting ahead of that and having some good empirical analysis to underpin the claims that we make about forests being important as a regulator of hydrological services has got to be high on the list. And I guess I would just, as a friendly amendment to that, not just like at the watershed scale, but this new stuff, you know, more at the continental scale. This is completely underinformed because I don't really know Brazil, but it's striking to me that the sort of attitude of Brazil towards international forest protection efforts, including REDD, has evolved in track with the increasing scientific understanding of the importance of the Amazon rainforest to providing rainfall to the Brazilian breadbasket. I don't think that's a coincidence. It could be, but I think as national governments start to understand that preserving forests is important for preserving their own domestic agricultural productivity, that is a way to really see that this is a win-win agenda and not a zero-sum trade-off.
So actually, it's more a comment. I'm from Brazil, and Brazil just passed the forest code, and it's actually the opposite because they have reduced the size of the riparian forest that protects the rivers. So despite all the efforts from the Brazilian Society of Academy of the scientists, and even Brazilian NGOs, what the government has done is to reduce the riparian forest and just taking into account the rural list or the soy producers or cattle ranchers. And so it's kind of a little bit challenging. And one of my questions is, I used to work in this agricultural frontier where the soy is expanding, and one of our biggest challenges is how to deal with the Asian market's demand that is increasing very much. So which kind of policies or private sector commitments like the Roundtable on Responsible Soy, or what kind of any other instruments can we try to develop or we can address to address this challenge of keeping the forest and keeping the water at the same time?
Right. Wait, that was just going to be a comment. No, sorry. Yeah, let me just say one comment on your comment and then move to your question. I know that the Brazilian Forest Code discussion is a very complex one, but I have to say, in that context, as well as in the context of the Indonesian moratorium on forest exploitation, which Jonah's going to talk about tomorrow, one can see those in a way as an inevitable pushback from interests that feel threatened by the REDD agenda. And to me, that's a really positive sign because it shows that the REDD agenda actually has some traction if people feel threatened by it. And since when has forestry world ever threatened anybody, with real, policy change? And so I think you could see it as a positive indicator. How to deal with growing global markets for these commodities that reduce forests. I mean, I will out myself as someone who had been a real skeptic about the potential efficacy of certification type, voluntary strategies back, 20 years ago when they were first, like the Forest Stewardship Council was first getting off the ground, because I was, at that time living in Indonesia, and it's like, well, great, you might be able to convince European and North American consumers in my lifetime that they need to preferentially, take certain commodities, but, in other parts of the world, it's just not going to happen in a relevant time frame. But I was wrong, because it turns out that you don't have to convince every individual consumer, because so much of world trade is mediated by these consumer-facing brands that are in fact global companies. And so either because they don't want Greenpeace hanging out their windows, or they don't want to have to invest in segregated supply chains, you can actually move markets by targeting some of these intermediary steps in the supply chain. And there's a whole industry of non-governmental organizations working on exactly that opportunity right now. And so in the short run, that is one way to attenuate the demand for unsustainably produced commodities. But over time, an emerging middle class in China or India or anywhere else is going to become, sensitive to some of these same, or is already becoming sensitive to some of these same issues. And in fact, it's a completely different topic, but I've heard an amazing story about how this campaign in China to get people to not prefer shark fin soup has had amazing success in a very, short amount of time. So I think we need not be too pessimistic about what's possible.
No, it's just a short comment about research addressing landscapes. I think maybe more than being a new item on the agenda, maybe what's happening now, it starts to be a little bit mainstream, which it was not before, because I think there has been a lot of research done about landscapes in a very long time. So what might be required now is to connect that research to the mainstream agenda, to conservation and sustainable development research. But there's a lot of things done already, I think. Yeah.
But that's not to minimize how hard it is, given the entrenched institutional structures that divide agriculture and forestry, that don't always play well together at various scales. So yeah, I agree with you. A lot of it's not like this is a new idea or anything, but I think the resilience of the divide shouldn't be underestimated.
Hi, Francis. I've seen you several times in Bogor as a Director General of CIFOR. So I would want to ask a question after you step down, whether or not, what's your view of Indonesia's state of forest, particularly with its commitments of greenhouse gas emission reductions, REDD+, and also expanding, you're talking about the expansion of palm oil in Indonesia as well.
Well, I mean, it's always a mixed and very dynamic picture. Certainly, it's been very important to have a head of state, and I'd say the same in Brazil. If you had the head of state talking about forests and the importance of forest conversation, that counts for a lot, And part of that is having the Norwegian letter of intent. $1 billion gets people's attention, even if it's kind of puny in the grand scheme of things in Indonesia. But it's mobilized political attention at the national level and a discussion about forests that has never happened before. And as I said in response to the previous comment, I think that even though the moratorium as constructed was quite disappointing in terms of how limited it was, not including secondary forests, for example, the fact that that discussion took place and now there is a formal structure for making forest maps transparently available to the public, which, let's be clear, people have been working on that for 30 years and never managed to get it done, but that happened within the last year and a half, has put into place governance processes that over time can only help make things better. The problem is that the time scale is the expansion of palm oil is happening so quickly, and the time scale for building institutions to rationally make land use allocation decisions it's going to be slow. And so the real key question right now is, what can, for lack of a better term, people like us, sort of interested outsiders who want to be helpful, what can we do both to help accelerate that institutional development that's going to be necessary to have a more rational, allocation of land. So things like some of the technology interventions that help to map, where the peatlands are and where there might be available land to divert, production onto from out of the peatlands. And as well as helping to do some of the market interventions that we were talking about before, creating a demand for more sustainably produced commodities so as to incentivize companies to do the right thing. But I find some particular, so it's a challenge, and there's no guarantee it's going to turn out right. And we're moving into a presidential election season, and sort of all bets are off with that process. But I see reasons to be optimistic. I mean, I was working in Indonesia with the Ford Foundation 25 years ago, and at that time, you couldn't even talk about indigenous people's rights without being labeled a subversive. I mean, there were just, you couldn't talk about illegal logging or corruption. These were just, taboo topics. And so now to fast forward 25 years later, where there's open discussion, like at the highest levels of the Ministry of Forestry, about the possibility of recognizing indigenous people's rights to land, it's just an amazing, progress. So progress is possible. And I think some of the things that we've been talking about here that are going on will help accelerate that progress. But, jury's still out.
First of all, Dr. Seymour, thank you very much for being here to start this conference for us. It's a great honor for us to be able to have this conversation with you. My question is regarding when you were mentioning the type of large-scale research that we need to address these landscape-level ecosystem services that forests provide for agriculture. And it made me think that some of the strongest, most powerful research that we find in the scientific community comes from medical science. And we would think about the sheer volume of research that comes out. The medical scientific community really blows us away here. And why is this possible? It was partially because it's funded in so much by the drug industry. So for us here in the biological community, perhaps it's time for us to start thinking about different sources and different avenues for the type of research that we need to do. So I wouldn't call it selling out to the agricultural industry, but perhaps leveraging the agriculture, large-scale agriculture is what our biological community and our forest community needs to start thinking about.
Let me just thank you for awarding me a doctorate, which I have not yet earned. But
one more question probably before we wrap things up and head over to the reception. Anyone else? We can take two.
Thank you. My name is Anna Herforth, and I'm coming here mostly from the nutrition community, nutrition and agriculture. And I really appreciate being briefed on all of these issues from you. They're probably things that most people in this room know a lot about, but a lot of them are a bit outside my typical realm, and I really appreciated the primer. And you were talking about the divides between forestry and agriculture. And in my work, usually, I work with the World Bank and FAO. Usually, what I'm trying to do is reduce the divide between agriculture and food security, or agriculture and nutrition even further. So usually I don't see agriculture as necessarily aiming to improve food security as their primary goal. And I was wondering, from your experience and your perspective, how often do agriculture investments or programs or endeavors actually aim to do something about conservation? Because that would seem to be where forests might fit in.
So the question is, how often do agriculture sector investments aim to do something about conservation?
Right.
I have to say, obviously there are interesting things going on all over the place, but the part of agriculture world that I've been intersecting with is remarkably traditional and still thinks about environmental issues as sort of externalities. It's like, oh, well, there's pollution from fertilizers and pesticides that we kind of need to worry about, but not a sort of ecosystem-based integrated approach to agriculture and forestry with conservation objectives. So I would say it's still the minority. It's not yet mainstreamed. That's my impression. There may be others in the room who know the universe better than I do, but definitely an area for further improvement. Although it's kind of discouraging to hear you say that the agriculture and nutrition silos are, bad too. You'd think those would have been closer.
Question over here, and after you're done with the response, we invite you all to head over to the reception on the other side of this floor.
Thank you for the presentation again, and for being here. It's great to have you. So you mentioned about some of the challenges that could, like the big brother in a way, have with the little brother, like the agriculture having more resources, mostly at the national level, will have sometimes a negative impact in little brother forest, especially in the arrangement and the institutional arrangement in some countries that the agriculture ministry has a lot of resources compared to forest, which is normally minimal in environmental ministry. So having said that, and you mentioning that that's one of the risks that we need to take, it also comes as an opportunity, and maybe I would like you to address if this is some of the communication aspect that could be strengthened, of having more the solution of the big brother helping the little brother and giving more resources and sharing those resources to actually have a holistic vision in terms of the landscape. So is the challenge, and based on your experience, more on different very, very narrow visions of those two sectors, and if actually is that a solution to be achieved soon, to really get some resources out of the environmental from the agriculture ministry to be shared? Is that because of the focus and in terms of communication hasn't really been addressed of these benefits of environmental services, or does it go beyond? What is the challenge to really avoid the little brother disappearing? Thank you.
That's a tough one. I think it comes back to the point I was trying to make about the importance of how problems are framed. And so, again, just to give a simple example, when President Yudhoyono made the commitment to reduce Indonesia's greenhouse gas emissions, and this was the first developing country government to make a voluntary commitment, and it was going to be, reducing by, help me, Jonah, 20-something% without international help and 41%, with international help. But, ambitious, commitments to reduce emissions. And so then the next step was to allocate those reductions on a ministry per ministry basis, so it's okay, transportation sector, your job is to reduce this much, and agriculture, your job is this much, and forestry, your job is that much. And by dividing it up, that sort of reinforced those, the silos, and didn't incentivize, collaboration. And so my instinct is that there's got to be a way to frame the problem, or the solution in the case of providing ecosystem services in a way that forces collaboration and would make it in the interest of an agriculture ministry, for example, to share resources to those who have the necessary expertise or jurisdiction to reach that, solve that particular problem or reach that particular objective. So again, it comes back to framing, I think.
Wraps it up for now. If we could give one more round of applause for Francis.